Long before the world knew the name Robert Mugabe, before the liberation struggle for an independent Zimbabwe carried a banner to rally behind or a leader's face to embody its cause, she was already there. Their courtship began like a fairy tale. She was a young teacher, bright and full of promise, falling in love with a shy, sharp-minded colleague in the corridors of a classroom in the newly independent state of Ghana. Welcome to Afro Perspectives. Today we step into the shadows of history to trace the life of Sarah Francesca Hayfron Mugabe, the woman now known to the rest of the world as Sally Mugabe. She is, or in her case, she was a woman whose name may not have echoed as loudly as that of her husband, Robert Mugabe, but her vision, her ideals, and the sacrifices she made in the cause of freedom for the state of Zimbabwe helped shape the trajectory of the nation and the people of Zimbabwe as a whole. Sally Mugabe was a teacher, comrade, confidante, and wife to the late Robert Mugabe. To the rest of the world, she was simply known as Sally, the First Lady of Zimbabwe. Behind the honorifics stood a woman whose life was defined not by her status, but by an unyielding devotion to the marginalized. Her fight for the disadvantaged outweighed personal ambition, and her compassion for children became a beacon that stirred the conscience of a newly independent nation. This is not simply the story of a president's wife. It is the story of Sally Mugabe, a woman who gave herself to a land not of her birth, but of her conviction. Zimbabwe became to her an adopted home, and through sacrifice and service, she edged her place in its struggle for freedom and its soul. To this day, fate and the people of Zimbabwe claim her as one of their own. To understand what the Hayfron family, and indeed the nation of Ghana, gave to Zimbabwe, we must return to the very beginning, to the roots of a story that crosses borders and binds two nations through one woman's life. Sarah, or as she's popularly known, Sally Francesca Hayfron, was born on the 6th of June 1932 in Aburi, a quiet town nestled in Ghana's eastern region. She came from a modest middle-class family devoted to education and public service, the kind of upbringing that instilled in her a sense of duty, discipline, and the conviction that knowledge was the surest path to freedom. Her father, Robert John Hayfron, was 27 at the time Sally was born. He taught agriculture at St. Mary's College, and her mother, Mavis Patricia Rena, was 23 years old at the time of her birth. She was a social worker, a lay magistrate, and she also ran a dressmaking shop. Sally was gifted and showed promise from an early age. In Aburi, she started school at the local Presbyterian primary school, and there her promise began to show. She later went to the prestigious Achimota Secondary School. True to the Hayfron tradition of public service, Sally chose to train as a school teacher at the Holy Child College. Fresh out of college, Sally took up a post at Takoradi Teacher Training College, eager to shape young minds in a newly independent Ghana. Just a short distance away, in Apoa Secondary School in Takoradi, another teacher, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, a reserved, sharp-minded intellectual from colonial southern Rhodesia, now modern Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe had come to West Africa to learn how a truly independent African nation looked and how it worked. Their paths might never have crossed if not for an accident. It was a burn to his hand that landed Robert Mugabe in a hospital bed, and it was Sally who kept visiting. It was the quiet strength of a woman who cared about the plight of others that attracted the idealistic Robert Mugabe to Sally. Robert Mugabe, however, decided he was needed more by his people and later returned to Zimbabwe, and that was in 1960. He was no longer just a teacher. He was now a rising political figure, watched closely by both allies and colonial authorities. Back in Ghana, Sally learned that Mugabe's political associates were planning a wedding for Robert, but not with Sally. They had chosen a local nurse named Abigail Kurangwa, someone regarded as more in tune with the local culture. Sally's response was swift. She journeyed to Zimbabwe, officially to meet Robert Mugabe's mother Bona and the wider Mugabe clan. Sally and Robert were married on the 29th of April 1961 at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Harare. Sally wore a pretty white wedding dress she had brought with herself from Ghana. It was specially prepared by her family for the wedding, and Robert wore a black suit for the occasion. The transition from married life to militant activism was swift. One moment Sally was a new bride. The next moment she was at the center of women's resistance to the imposition of ever-increasing discriminatory rule by the white settler regime. In 1962, Sally led a march of women from the National Democratic Party to the then governor's offices, that is Sir Humphrey Gibbs, to appeal for the release of arrested African nationalist leaders and for the fair treatment of political prisoners. For that simple request, she was charged with sedition and sentenced to 5 years in jail. She appealed against the sentence and was restricted to her home in Highfield. The appeal court never heard the case. Sally, together with her husband Robert, went first through the neighboring country of Botswana, and then she ended up in Tanzania, where the nationalist leaders intended to form a government in exile. Sally Mugabe had just buried her first child who had died at birth and was now carrying a second child. Although the weight of persecution could not break down her faith in her husband's cause, she could not be mother, freedom fighter, and fugitive all at once. It was in August of 1964 in Dar es Salaam when Sally Mugabe gave birth to a son, a baby boy whose arrival carried both joy and an unspoken burden. The pregnancy itself was complicated by Sally's high blood pressure, lack of proper medical care, and the political uncertainty shrouding the struggle. Both Sally and Robert gave the boy the name Namozenyika, sacrifice for one's country in Shona. In December of 1964, Sally could see no hope living the life of a political refugee in Dar es Salaam. She could not return to Zimbabwe either. She ended up returning to Ghana, to her parents in Ghana. Although Sally had lost her first baby at birth in 1961, it was in 1966 that she suffered the worst tragedy of her life, at least at that point, up to that point in time. Her 3-year-old son Namozenyika caught an infection. Her twin sister Esther, who was a practicing medical doctor, told her that it was cerebral malaria, and despite her efforts, she could not save the boy, and he later died. To compound her grief, Sally had hoped that the authorities would grant Robert a temporary release from detention, allowing him to stand beside her as they laid their only child to rest. That request was refused without sentiment. On the day of the funeral, even the comfort of her own family could not hide the absence of the boy's father, Robert Mugabe. Sally's husband, Robert. In time, Sally resolved to leave Ghana for London, determined to continue her education. In 1967, Sally went into exile in London and resided in Ealing Broadway, West London. Her stay in Britain was financed at least in part by the British Ariel Foundation. Sally herself chose to study home economics, and she worked in a range of jobs, including as a secretary to the director of the Africa Centre in London's Covent Garden. She later worked as a clerk with the Runnymede Trust in the field of race relations. In London, Sally assisted Robert Mugabe, who was now locked up in detention, in the only way she could, by helping him to study. Sally spent hours in London libraries, collecting books and sending copies to Mugabe. Since some books were banned in Zimbabwe, Sally would only copy sections from the banned books and copy them by hand. She would then send them to her husband in jail by secretive means. She would paste copies of books into toothpaste boxes in the hope that the prison guards would not spot them. While Sally's husband Robert was languishing in detention, the British immigration authorities attempted to deport her in 1970. Immigration authorities in Britain insisted that Sally's time in London was up and that Sally should be returned to Ghana because she had entered Britain on a Ghanaian passport. Sally herself claimed that she was now a citizen of the then state of Rhodesia by virtue of her marriage to Robert Mugabe. On that basis, she argued that she should be allowed to stay in Britain as she faced persecution in Zimbabwe. Eventually, after a petition signed by at least 400 MPs, the British authorities allowed Sally to stay in Britain. It was in November of 1974 that Sally got a surprise. She was invited by President Kaunda of Zambia to visit Lusaka. Her husband Robert had been granted temporary release from prison by the Rhodesian authorities to attend negotiations on the transition to independence. For Sally, it was definitely a shock to see Robert among the group of negotiators flown in from Harare after 10 years of a forced separation. She collapsed of shock and managed to see Robert in President Kaunda's private clinic at State House in Lusaka. That reunion was brief, but after 2 days Robert was back in detention and Sally flew back to London. Her loneliness was short-lived this time. For in December of 1974, after 10 long years of forced separation, Sally got the news she had long been waiting for. Her husband, Robert, was now a free man. However, that freedom was short-lived. For in April of 1975, her husband, Robert, crossed from Zimbabwe into Mozambique, and from there he was placed under house arrest by the Mozambican authorities. Sally immediately went to Sweden to lobby the authorities there to put pressure on the Mozambican government for her husband's release. When Robert Mugabe was finally released from house arrest in the town of Quelimane in Mozambique, Sally joined up with him in Maputo. And for both Sally and Robert, that was the first time they shared the joys of marital bliss under one roof since their short-lived honeymoon in the suburb of Highfields in Harare. Sally converted the Portuguese-style villa at number 2 Dona Maria Avenue in Maputo's posh tree-lined suburb of Somersfield into something both of them could call a home. It was both a home for Sally and her husband, as well as a source of support for the young freedom fighters. For the young freedom fighters, Sally was a mother figure, a source of warmth in the turbulence of a conflict. In 1978, she was elected ZANU-PF Deputy Secretary for the Women's League. In the military training camps of Chimoyo and Nyazonya, there was a shortage of clothes, medicines, and food. Sally again used her contacts in Sweden and Norway to appeal for support. She did not stop there. She set up tailoring classes where refugees from Zimbabwe learned to sew clothes. It was not long before everyone started fondly referring to Sally as Amai, meaning mother of the revolution. In Mozambique, Sally was quickly accepted as a mother figure to all the young freedom fighters. And on the 27th of January 1980, after years and years in exile, Sally took off from Maputo's Malavane airport, accompanied by her husband Robert, on a plane journey to Zimbabwe and landed at the airport in Harare. Sally spent the next 3 months campaigning in the election alongside her husband Robert. After the election victory in April 1980, she assumed a new role, the national role as wife of Zimbabwe's first black prime minister. Long after Zimbabwe had attained its independence, the majority of the people in the country identified with Sally Mugabe as someone who had their interests at heart. Even well after settling into the busy schedule of life in State House as wife of independent Zimbabwe's first black prime minister, Sally did not give up on the need to help those in need. She got in touch with one of her friends in London who donated sewing machines, children's books, and even measles vaccines. As early as 1981, she became the patron of Mtemwa Leprosy Center in the northern town of Mutoko. She raised money and donations for the center and helped erase the stigma and stereotype associated with lepers. Her concern for children was rewarded when she was invited to be the executive chairperson of the Child Survival and Development Foundation in Zimbabwe. As if that was not enough, in 1988, with assistance from UNICEF, she established the Child Survival Development Committee for Zimbabwe and increased international awareness of the plight of children in Southern Africa. In recognition for her commitment to uplifting women from all walks of life, in 1989, Sally was elected the first secretary of ZANU-PF's Women's League. However, if Sally was committed to charity and helping the marginalized in Zimbabwe, she did not show the public how her health was declining. She had long struggled with diabetes, and then in the early 1980s, she developed problems with her kidneys, and she had to attend 2 sessions of dialysis a week. As if that was not enough, her husband Robert, who had now assumed the title of President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, and to whom she had devoted so many years of life, and she had been loyal for so many years, he began an affair with a young secretary who worked in his office. That secretary was a beautiful mother of one called